WNBA's up is because of Angel Reese.
Did you see what Jason Whitlock just said about Angel Reese? He didn't just disagree with her, he completely exposed the financial delusion behind her demands for more money. While Reese and Carrington are threatening to sit out if they don't get paid more, they're ignoring one massive problem.
I went from liking Angel Reese a little bit to now I don't like Angel Reese. I'm back to like, she's just bad news.
The WNBA is losing $30 million every in a game of chess. Is this the most out-of-touch demand in sports history?
And, you know, she's fallen right in line with the rest of the WNBA. She's just an angry feminist.
You think Angel Reese's demands are reasonable? Wait until you hear what Jason Whitlock just said about the WNBA's financial situation. While Reese and her fellow players are out there demanding bigger contracts and more money, Whitlock dropped a financial bomb that completely shatters their argument. He didn't just disagree with Reese. He exposed the uncomfortable truth that most basketball fans don't realize about women's professional basketball.
They have a sit down on Angel Reese's podcast and start talking about the money they want and what the WNBA is planning. If they don't get there, the players don't get their money.
When Angel Reese sits on her podcast talking about how WNBA players deserve more, Whitlock points to a harsh reality. The league has been hemorrhaging money for years. We're not talking about small losses either. The WNBA is losing approximately $30 million every single year. Let that sink in for a moment. Report itself. The most brutal part, Whitlock suggested that instead of demanding more money, these athletes should actually be paying to play given the dire financial circumstances of the WNBA. Can you imagine any other professional athlete being told they should pay for the privilege of playing? That's how bad Whitlock thinks the situation is.
And these women are talking about, if we don't get what we want, if we don't get what we deserve, if you got what you deserved, you'd be paying to play in the WNBA.
What makes Whitlock's critique so powerful is how he frames the fundamental disconnect between what these players believe they're worth versus the harsh business reality. While Reese and others talk about their value and leverage, Whitlock points to that 25 to 30 million annual loss figure as the only number that truly matters in this conversation. In his view, how can you demand a bigger slice of a pie that doesn't even exist?
NBA, but to be fair, and you're right about that, silence is golden, and sometimes less is more when it comes to players talking and using their platform and getting out their message.
Things got even more interesting when Whitlock addressed Reese's specific threat to sit out games if their salary demands weren't met. You know how he responded? He basically dared her to follow through because he knows it would have zero impact on the league's success or viewership.
I wonder though if the average WNBA player that none of us knows is actually saying, hey Angel, would you shut the f*** up? Seriously. Because this does not help the perception of the league.
Whitlock's dismissive reaction isn't just about calling Reese's bluff. It's pointing to a strategic disaster happening in real time. The overexposure of today's athletes through constant social media presence and endless podcasts is fundamentally changing how fans view them, and not in a good way. According to Whitlock, we're watching these WNBA stars sabotage themselves tweet by tweet and podcast by podcast.
You know, Steve, when I watched that video, and they don't understand they're harming themselves.
When Whitlock says Angel Reese is playing checkers in a game of chess, he's highlighting a fundamental strategic error. These players are broadcasting every thought, grievance, and demand to the world without considering the consequences.
That we're getting too much exposure to Angel Reese and Dejanay Carrington and the rest of these players. And so athletes from previous generations that didn't have podcasts, didn't have social media.
Think about it. In previous generations, we barely knew anything about our favorite athletes beyond their performance on the court. Michael Jordan wasn't giving daily updates about his contract negotiations or posting his thoughts on league policies.
They had the advantage of, we didn't know much about them. We didn't know how greedy, entitled, stupid, we didn't know because they weren't overexposed.
Did you hear that? Whitlock made that exact point, explaining that athletes from previous eras benefited because we didn't know how greedy, entitled, stupid they weren't overexposed. When today's players constantly appear on podcasts and social media, they're revealing sides of themselves that fans might not want to see. The entitlement, the lack of strategic thinking, the short-sightedness.
These guys are overexposed and they're playing a game of checkers in a game of chess.
The podcast conversation between Reese and Carrington is the perfect example of this problem. By publicly discussing strike plans and salary demands, they're showing their hand to everyone, including league executives and fans who might not be sympathetic to their cause. What's more, they're potentially creating division within their own ranks.
Anyway.
And need this job. We're all working for a vision. Don't ruin it for the rest of us.
Speaking of players who might be thinking, Angel, would you shut up? There's a glaring omission in Reese and Carrington's entire leverage discussion that Whitlock immediately zeroed in on. How can you talk about WNBA player value for an entire podcast without once mentioning the name Caitlin Clark?
And if I'm an average, everyday WNBA player who appreciates what we have, I'm thinking, would you just be quiet? Seriously.
Whitlock didn't let this calculated silence slide, pointing out that the two players most publicly antagonistic toward Clark somehow managed to have a full conversation about league leverage while completely avoiding the elephant in the room, the very player driving unprecedented interest in women's basketball.
It's funny that the two people having this conversation are two people that absolutely hate Caitlin Clark and are jealous of Caitlin Clark.
You see, Whitlock didn't just call out this omission, he hammered home what it reveals about Reese and Carrington's real agenda. It's no coincidence, he explained, that the two players most hostile toward Caitlin Clark are the ones plotting a work stoppage. While Reese is out there, Clark plays, viewership spikes dramatically, sometimes tripling or quadrupling normal figures. Meanwhile, games without her often return to the league's historically modest audience numbers.
Because it's all Caitlin Clark, but instead, you have two very delusional people. Oh, we deserve this. We blah, blah, blah.
We?
Whitlock didn't mince words about what this means. 90% of the renewed interest in the WNBA is based around one singular player, Caitlin Clark. He argued that Clark's arrival has single-handedly transformed the league's visibility and marketability, yet Reese and Carrington refuse to acknowledge the source of their newfound leverage. Instead, they're effectively riding Clark's coattails while simultaneously refusing to give her credit.
What did they lose? I think 29 million last year. They're saying they lost.
Well, that's an improvement.
Maybe it's 50. Well, yeah, maybe it was 50 million. It's been 29 straight years of losing money.
Now, what do you think would happen to the WNBA if Clark wasn't part of the picture? Whitlock laid out this brutal truth that strips away any illusion about where the power really lies. Without Clark driving viewership, attendance, and media coverage, there would be absolutely no leverage for Reese or anyone else to demand higher salaries. The league would simply return to its pre-Clark financial struggles, making Reese's threats completely hollow.
We haven't heard anything from Caitlin. She's just gotten to work. In the offseason.
Yeah. She doesn't have to run her mouth for attention. She can actually let her play on the court run her mouth for her.
Whitlock's warning about what happens if WNBA players go on strike should terrify Angel Reese and anyone else threatening work stoppages. Unlike established sports leagues with decades of fan loyalty, the WNBA is walking on thin ice with its newfound momentum. Whitlock flat out says that work stoppages will irritate fans and there will be lasting impact from that. He's not just speculating, he's seen this movie before.
And I'm telling you, they do have obvious leverage because of Caitlin Clark and because of the momentum that women's basketball does have.
Remember the 1994 MLB strike? That disaster nearly killed baseball's popularity overnight. The sport had to rely on the steroid-fueled home run race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa to win fans back. But here's the crucial difference Whitlock points out. Baseball had generations of deeply embedded cultural relevance to fall back on. The WNBA doesn't have that luxury. They've had mere months of genuine mainstream momentum, primarily thanks to one rookie.
Even understand the history. What happened to Major League Baseball in 1994? Work stoppages will irritate fans, and there will be lasting impact from that. These guys had to steroid up and hit a bunch of home runs in order to get those fans back.
The timing couldn't be worse for Strike Talk. Just as casual sports fans are finally giving women's basketball a chance, players are threatening to take the ball and go home. Whitlock cuts through the fantasy with brutal clarity. He's pointing out what should be obvious. Fans aren't yet loyal to the league itself. They're following the Clark phenomenon.
We should just be careful. Major League Baseball, there could be a work stoppage in Major League Baseball in 2026, which, if that happened, that's more of a spotlight for the WNBA.
Think about what this means for Angel Reese's bargaining position. The foundation she's standing on while making demands is essentially quicksand. Whitlock emphasizes that the last thing they need is some sort of work stoppage because it would just ruin a good thing. This current golden opportunity for women's basketball could vanish overnight.
And so they're gonna risk ruining a good thing. The last thing they need is some sort of work stoppage.
What makes Whitlock's assessment so devastating is that it exposes a fundamental strategic error. The WNBA's collective bargaining agreement doesn't even expire until 2027, yet players like Reese are already floating strike threats. With the league's financial situation still precarious, these players risk killing the goose before it has a chance to lay golden eggs.
Well, Major League Baseball has so much history that they could survive to some degree what they did to their reputation and their fan base.
Whitlock's final verdict is merciless. These players are actively harming themselves through their short-sighted demands. Instead of nurturing the fragile growth the league is experiencing, they're impatiently demanding immediate rewards that the economics simply can't support. They're not just playing a dangerous game with the league's future, they're putting their own careers at risk.
Daniel Podcast, WNBA players striking would be the most tone-deaf pro athlete move in history. The WNBA has never made a profit in its entire existence. Not gonna lie, I'm rooting for this to happen.
So Whitlock's prediction is even more mind-blowing than we thought. He's not just talking about the WNBA's current problem. He's suggesting we might see a completely different league emerge from all this. Think about it. If the WNBA continues bleeding money while players like Reese keep pushing for more, Whitlock believes we could see alternative opportunities pop up for the top women's basketball talent.
The WNBA was founded in 1996 and has never made a profit in 29 years. Question for the business gurus. Can you think of any other for-profit business in America that is 29 years old, has never made a profit, and still exists? I honestly can't. The WNBA may be the only one.
What's most fascinating is how this fits perfectly with his Clark analysis. If the WNBA implodes under financial pressure, where does Clark go? She